It was just another evening in the city. Busy streets, honking cars, and people lost in their own worlds. I had just finished my errands and was heading home when I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Across the street, near a small convenience store, an old man was struggling to pick up his groceries. A few cans had rolled onto the pavement, but before he could gather them, a group of young men surrounded him. At first, I thought they were helping him, but within seconds, I realized I was wrong. One of them nudged his shopping bag with his foot, sending more of his items tumbling onto the ground. Another let out a laugh, nudging his friend as if they were sharing some inside joke. "Hey, old man, need some help?" One of them mocked, bending down only to pick up an apple and take a bite out of it. The others burst into laughter. The elderly man looked up, his face filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. His frail hands trembled slightly as he tried to gather his groceries, but the boys wouldn't let him. One kicked a can further down the sidewalk. "Come on, Grandpa, you're too slow," another taunted. People passed by. Some looked but quickly averted their gaze. Others didn't even seem to notice. That was the worst part, not the bullying itself, but the sheer indifference of the world around them. I felt anger bubbling inside me. How could they treat someone like this? I clenched my fists, ready to step in. But just as I moved forward, a deep voice cut through the air. "Ayo, what's going on here?" The voice was unmistakable. It carried weight, authority, almost like a force of nature. The group of boys stopped laughing. I turned my head, and sure enough, standing just a few feet away was Big Shaq. Yes, that Big Shaq. He was massive, towering over everyone on the street. His broad shoulders and imposing frame made him look even larger than he did on TV. But it wasn't just his size. It was the way he carried himself. Calm, composed, yet radiating a presence that demanded respect. The bullies exchanged nervous glances. One of them, the one who had taken the apple, tried to play it cool. "Just having some fun, man," he said with a shrug, but his voice lacked confidence. Big Shaq took a slow step forward. The group instinctively took a step back. "That don't look like fun to me," Shaq said, his deep voice rumbling through the air. He then turned his gaze toward the elderly man, who was still crouched down, trying to gather his scattered items. Without hesitation, Shaq bent down and started picking them up. For a second, no one spoke. The street noise seemed to fade, as all attention focused on him. The bullies shifted uncomfortably. "You good, sir?" Shaq asked, his tone gentle, completely different from the way he had addressed the group. The old man hesitated before nodding. I just needed to get home." Shaq handed him his groceries and helped him to his feet. Then slowly, he turned his attention back to the group. His eyes locked onto them, studying each one. "So," he said, crossing his massive arms, "who here thinks they're tough?" Silence. The leader of the group, the one who had taken the apple, glanced at his friends, searching for backup. But none of them met his gaze. I watched, waiting to see what would happen next. The air felt charged, heavy, with anticipation. Big Shaq's presence alone made everything feel different. The air around us seemed to change as he stood there, looking down at the group of bullies. His massive frame intimidating, yet controlled. His posture was relaxed, but there was no mistaking the strength in his voice, the way his eyes bore into each of the boys, challenging them without saying a word. The tension was palpable. The group of young men, who had moments ago been laughing and taunting the elderly man, now stood frozen. It was as if the entire street had come to a halt, and all the noise, the honking cars, the distant chatter, the sound of footsteps faded into the background. All that mattered now was the moment that had shifted the balance of power. And Big Shaq was in complete control. The leader of the group, the one who had taken the apple, tried to muster up some courage. He straightened his posture, pushed his chest out, and forced a cocky smile. "What's your problem, man?" he said, though his voice was shaky, not nearly as confident as before. Shaq didn't even flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the young man, and for a second I thought the bully might back down. But instead, he took another step forward, attempting to show he wasn't scared. The others behind him seemed less certain, but they stayed close, like they were waiting for something to happen. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his gaze not leaving the leader for a second. "You think it's funny to mess with someone just because they're older?" His voice was calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "You think kicking an old man's groceries around is something worth laughing about?" The boy's smile faded, but he tried to keep his cool. "Nah, we were just joking around. It's no big deal." "No big deal?" Shaq repeated, his voice lowering now, almost a growl. "You think that's no big deal? Tell me, how would you like it if someone came up to you and kicked your stuff around like it was some kind of joke?" The young man hesitated. His bravado faltered for just a moment, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. Shaq's words had clearly hit him harder than any punch or insult ever could. It was as though the bully was finally being forced to think, to process what had just happened, what he had just done. "Look, man," the boy said, his voice cracking a little. "We didn't mean to." "You didn't mean to," Shaq interrupted, taking a step closer. "Well, guess what? It doesn't matter whether you meant it or not. What matters is that you did it. And that old man over there, he didn't deserve that." I could see the bully trying to salvage his pride, but Shaq wasn't having any of it. The entire situation had taken a turn, and it was clear that Shaq wasn't just going to let it slide. There was a deep lesson here, one that the boy clearly hadn't expected, and it was starting to sink in, slowly but surely. "You think you're tough, don't you?" Shaq asked, his voice suddenly softer, almost amused, but with a sharp edge. "You've got all your friends around, laughing, thinking you're the king of the block. But let me tell you something. True strength doesn't come from putting others down. It comes from lifting people up." The young man's mouth opened as if he was about to say something, but nothing came out. He stood there, frozen, not knowing how to respond to Shaq's words. His friends looked at each other uneasily, unsure whether they should step in or just stay quiet. Big Shaq took a deep breath and let it out slowly, his hands now resting on his hips. He was calm, but the energy around him was intense. "Let me tell you something," he continued, his voice low but firm. "I've been where you are. I've made mistakes. I've said things I didn't mean. But the difference is, I learned from them. And if you're smart, you'll do the same. Because one day, you might find yourself in a situation where no one's there to laugh at you. And that's when you'll realize all the tough talk and all the jokes, none of it matters." There was silence for a moment. The leader of the group, who had been the most vocal, looked down at the ground. His friends were all looking at him now, waiting for him to say something, to react. But he didn't. For the first time, I saw the boy look vulnerable, as if Shaq's words had pierced through the wall of bravado he had built around himself. Are you done? Shaq asked, breaking the silence. The bully nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. He didn't look so tough anymore. In fact, he looked like a kid who had just been caught doing something stupid, something that had consequences far greater than he had anticipated. Shaq looked at the other boys. And you, he said, his gaze sweeping over the rest of the group. Are you all okay with this? Are you just going to stand there and watch someone get humiliated? Or are you going to step up and do the right thing? The others exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence shattered. One by one, they began to back away, no longer feeling like they had the upper hand. They had come to mess with an old man, but they were the ones who were being called out, who were now the ones on the defensive. All right, man, we're done, the leader said, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll leave him alone. Shaq nodded once, and that was it. The group slowly walked away, their heads down, the bravado completely gone. The elderly man, who had been watching the entire scene unfold in silence, seemed to breathe a little easier. His groceries were still scattered on the ground, but he was no longer the victim of a cruel joke. And in a way, neither were the bullies. Big Shaq turned to him, offering a smile. You all right, sir? The old man nodded, a grateful look in his eyes. Thank you. Thank you so much. Shaq patted him on the shoulder. Don't mention it. Just doing what's right. As the bullies disappeared into the distance, I stood there for a moment, still processing what had just happened. I had seen fights break out on the streets before, but I had never witnessed anything like this. Shaq didn't need to raise his voice or throw a punch. He had done something far more powerful. He had taught a lesson, one that the bullies would carry with them for a long time. I couldn't help but smile to myself. Shaq had handled the situation with such ease, yet the impact of his words would last far longer than any physical confrontation. As the group of bullies disappeared into the distance, the street slowly began to return to its usual hum. The cars resumed their honking, pedestrians went about their business, and the sounds of the city filled the air once again. But for me, everything felt different now. I couldn't shake the image of the elderly man, still standing there, holding his groceries. He had been through something awful, and I had witnessed it all. And then, Big Shaq had stepped in. There was a stillness that lingered in the air, a sense of justice having been served without any violence or aggression. Shaq had used words as his weapon, and they had landed harder than any physical confrontation ever could. I walked over to the elderly man, who was now standing a little taller, his back straighter, even though the weight of his bags was still a challenge. He looked at me with a tired smile, his eyes full of gratitude. You okay, sir? I asked gently. He nodded, still holding on to the groceries, his hands shaking just a little. Yes, I am now. I don't know what to say. That man, I never thought anyone would stand up for me like that. I smiled at him, feeling a sense of warmth in my chest. Sometimes, it takes someone who knows the right thing to say, and the right way to say it. The old man chuckled softly, his smile widening. I guess so. He looked back in the direction the bullies had gone, as if trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. I didn't know what to do. I thought for a moment I was on my own. His voice trailed off, the weight of the moment still heavy in his mind. Well, you weren't alone, I said, my gaze shifting to where Shaq had stood. He was walking down the street now, blending back into the city as though nothing extraordinary had just taken place. I was left in awe of how effortlessly he had done it. There had been no yelling, no aggressive moves. He had simply used his presence and his words to change the entire course of the situation. Do you think they'll learn? I asked the old man, though I wasn't sure I had the answer myself. I don't know, he replied, his voice thoughtful. But maybe, just maybe, they'll think twice next time. People don't realize how much damage words can do. And sometimes, it takes someone showing them how to do the right thing. I nodded in agreement. It was a powerful statement, and one that resonated deeply within me. Shaq had done more than just stop the bullying that day. He had shown us all a better way to respond to aggression and disrespect. He had proven that you didn't need to fight fire with fire, that the most powerful form of strength wasn't physical. It was in your ability to hold your ground and make others see the truth. I looked back toward the direction where Shaq had walked, watching him as he disappeared into the crowd. There was no fanfare, no applause. He wasn't looking for recognition. He had simply done the right thing because it was the right thing to do. I wish more people could see it that way, I muttered to myself, more to the old man than anyone else. He smiled faintly, glancing at me with a knowing look. The world needs more people like that, he said softly. People who don't just talk about doing the right thing, but actually live it. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The impact of the situation wasn't just about the bully being put in his place or the old man being helped. It was the lesson in integrity, in standing up for what's right, even when it's hard. Shaq had demonstrated something much more profound that day. It wasn't about power or size. It was about having the courage to challenge wrongdoing and the wisdom to do so with respect and calm. Shaq had walked away, leaving a lasting impression on everyone around him, even if he hadn't meant to. The young man who had started it all, the bully, would likely never forget the weight of Shaq's words. It was a moment of reckoning for him, one that would likely stick with him far longer than any punch ever could. I had learned something too. Watching how Shaq handled the situation, I realized that many of us often resort to anger or violence when faced with injustice. It's easy to give in to that urge to lash out, but what Shaq had done was the complete opposite. He had used calm and logic, and in doing so, he had flipped the script. The bully had been rendered speechless, not because he had been forced into submission, but because he had been made to see the error of his ways. That was true power. I glanced back at the old man, who was now slowly walking toward the store to pay for his groceries. "Take care, sir," I called out to him. He turned and waved, still smiling. "Thank you again. You're a good person, helping out like that." I waved back, a little embarrassed but grateful for the recognition. "No problem." It was Shaq who made all the difference, really. He nodded thoughtfully, his eyes twinkling. Yes, but sometimes all it takes is one person to step up. And today, it was him. As I watched the elderly man shuffle into the store, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of admiration for Shaq. He hadn't done it for glory, and he hadn't done it for attention. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. He had made the world a little bit better that day, just by being the person he was. And that's when it hit me. The ultimate lesson wasn't about the bully or even the elderly man. It was about all of us. We all have the power to make a difference in someone's life. We all have the ability to choose how we respond to the world around us. We can choose kindness over cruelty, respect over indifference, and strength through understanding. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. Shaq had taught me something invaluable, not through words alone, but through his actions. He had shown me that being strong wasn't about dominating others or proving a point. It was about standing up for what's right, even when no one's looking. It was about being a force for good, without ever needing to say a word. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind of strength the world needed more of. The next few days felt different. The usual hustle and bustle of the city seemed quieter, somehow, more reflective. It was as if the incident with the bully and the elderly man had planted a seed in my mind, and it was growing, slowly, in the background. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, the way Shaq had stepped in, the way he had spoken, so calm and measured. There was something about that moment that stayed with me, something that felt like a turning point in my life. It wasn't just the bully who had learned something that day. I had too, but I didn't expect what came next. The unexpected twist to this entire event happened on a rainy afternoon, just as I was walking down the same street where the incident had unfolded. The clouds above were thick and dark, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. I was deep in thought, lost in the sounds of the city, when I heard a voice calling my name. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the rain, but it was enough to catch my attention. I turned to see the elderly man from a few days ago, standing just outside a small cafe, looking a bit lost. I hurried over to him, my heart racing a little. "Are you okay, sir?" He smiled at me, though it seemed more strained than before. Yes, I'm fine. I wanted to talk to you for a moment." He was holding the same groceries he had that day, though they seemed heavier this time. His hands were trembling, and it looked like he had been standing there for a while, waiting for someone. "I'm glad I found you," he continued, his voice soft but steady. "I've been meaning to thank you properly for what you did. You really saved me from that bully, and well, I don't know how to express my gratitude." I was a little surprised. "It wasn't just me, sir. It was Big Shaq who really made all the difference." He nodded slowly, his expression serious. Yes, Big Shaq did something incredible. But I wanted to tell you something. Something you might not know." His voice dropped, and I noticed a sadness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. I waited, not sure where this conversation was going. "You see, those bullies, they weren't the first to treat me like that," he said, his voice quieter now, like he was sharing a secret. "I've lived in this city for a long time, and over the years, I've come across all kinds of people. But it hasn't always been easy. I'm alone, you know. I don't have family nearby. And sometimes, the isolation gets to be too much." I could feel my heart starting to break for him. This wasn't just about one incident. It was a long pattern, something he had endured in silence for a long time. "I wasn't always like this," he continued, his eyes clouding with memories. "I used to be strong. I had a family, a good job. But over time, everything changed. My wife passed away, and my children, well, they grew up and moved away. And it's hard, you know, being old being forgotten. People don't see you the same way anymore. I was speechless, unsure of how to respond. I hadn't realized the depth of his loneliness. He wasn't just a man being bullied in the moment. He was a man who had faced years of isolation and neglect, and the bullying was just another symptom of that. The thing is, he said, looking up at me, I was starting to give up. I was starting to think that maybe this was all there was for me. Just me, my groceries, and the rain. I had accepted that people would treat me like I was invisible, that I was no longer worthy of respect. But then Big Shaq came, and he reminded me that I'm still here, that I still matter. His words hit me harder than I expected. I had thought this whole thing was just about the immediate situation, the bully being put in his place. But this was more than that. It was about the restoration of dignity, the acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, still cared. I can't thank him enough, the elderly man whispered, his voice trembling. But more than that, I wanted to thank you. You stood with me. You didn't turn away. I was at a loss for words. I didn't really do much, sir. He shook his head, his eyes welling with tears. You did. You made me feel seen. In a world where people ignore you, where you're treated like you don't exist anymore. That's something. That's everything. The rain was starting to come down heavier now, but we both stood there, not moving, as if time had stopped for a moment. I couldn't fully grasp what he was saying, but I could feel it. The weight of what he had lived through, the depth of his gratitude. I don't have much left in this world, he said quietly, but I know I can still make a difference. I've been thinking about what happened, about how Big Shaq stood up for me. And I realized something. I don't have to be a victim. I can choose to be strong too. I was stunned. This man, who had seemed so frail just a few days ago, was standing taller now, in a way I hadn't expected. He was reclaiming his own sense of power, his own dignity. I think I'm going to start standing up for myself more, he said with a small but determined smile. Not just with people like that bully, but with life, with my own fears. I've been letting them control me for too long. I could see the fire in his eyes now, the spark of something I hadn't seen before. He wasn't just talking about standing up to bullies. He was talking about standing up to everything that had made him feel small, everything that had tried to take his power away. I'm proud of you, sir, I said softly, feeling a lump in my throat. You don't know how much it means to me to hear you say that. He smiled, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Thank you for making me remember who I am. I think in the end, it wasn't just about me getting help. It was about me remembering that I can still help myself. And with that, he turned to walk away, his back straighter than it had been before, the weight of his groceries seeming a little lighter. As he disappeared into the rain, I stood there, my heart full. The lesson I had learned wasn't just from Big Shaq, it was from the elderly man too. Strength doesn't just come from physical force or loud words. It comes from within, from the decision to rise above the circumstances that try to keep you down. It comes from choosing not to be a victim, no matter how many times life tries to make you feel small. As I walked away, I felt like a part of me had shifted too. I had witnessed something beautiful, something I would never forget. And I knew, no matter what happened from here on out, that I would carry this lesson with me. We are all capable of standing up for ourselves. All it takes is the right moment, the right person to remind us of our strength. And in that moment, we can change everything.